has now got a seat at the table, and we've got a list of the people who are registered to speak this afternoon. We'll only allow the people to speak who are registered. Just for the benefit of those who were not here this morning or maybe weren't in the audience, there might be a few of you, the way we're going to deal with it this afternoon, a couple of points. We're going to deal with one question out of order. So question 26, I agreed with Ms Kitts when she came to a session the other day that we'd deal with question 26. It's a very discreet, small question that we deal with that first and then return back to the agenda. And then she can leave if she wants to leave. And then we'll return to question 1, obviously not forgetting those. Question 1, I think we might skip because it becomes subsumed with lots of other questions, really. It was a general point. But in terms of how we do this afternoon, same as this morning, we'll turn to the council for comments when we introduce a question, and then rather than trying to dot around the room with different people putting different nameplates up at different times, I'll sweep around the tables and pick up who wants to speak as I go around. And as this morning, there's only an opportunity to speak once on each question, so when we deal with a question and you speak, you'll need to tell me everything you want to say in that moment, and then obviously the council have a right of reply. We'll come back to them. And that's how it's going to work. It seemed to work all right this morning, and good. Hopefully we'll get through this afternoon unscathed at a reasonable time. We'll probably go until around 6 o'clock. It doesn't take that long. If it's long, we'll have to find a way of dealing with it at a later point. Is there anybody particularly that needs to get away for sort of caring responsibilities or anything else at a certain time? And I'll try and accommodate you as best I can, because I'm conscious that Mr. Deves. 5 o'clock. Yeah, that's quite reasonable. Yeah. So if there's something you want to say, you've not come to just try and.
I have a trustee meeting in Ludlow at 6.
Right.
Which I have to chair.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Likewise.
Has Mr. Chung got a problem? No. No. Okay.
Just pulling his leg.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Richards has inquired after him. I'm sure him I'm fine.
I wonder if I might be able to leave around 5 o'clock, if that's okay.
Okay. I mean, I'm hoping we'll be finished by then, but you never can tell with these things. It's yeah. Okay, so I think that's covered all those points, and I think if there's any other questions arise as we go along, just shout. We'll have a tea break around about 3 o'clock, and as this morning, we'll try and keep it as quick as possible, just to allow people to get refreshments. Okay, so question 26 is, to say, quite a discrete question about whether settlement boundaries are justified, and I know Ms Kitts particularly wanted to just speak on this matter. Does the council want to say anything before I bring in Ms Kitts? No, okay, and then I'll come to anybody else that wants to speak.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon. What I'd like to say, the council has confirmed that where it is proposed that a settlement will have a development boundary as a draft social local plan, the starting point for identifying the appropriate boundary was generally the existing development boundary within the adopted local plan. Because there has been no accurate assessment of the boundaries, the scoring does not always reflect the situation on the ground. This means that the opportunity for the development, either through allocation of sites or through windfall development, has not therefore been fully explored. Whilst the council say in its matter 3 statement that these boundaries were then refined through consideration of both extent or existing built form and relevant changes, that would not appear to be the case in the respect of St Martin's. The settlement boundary is not justified, I suggest, in respect of St Martin's Community Hub. It has not been reviewed to take account of the development that has occurred since the LP was adopted. Boundaries should have been reviewed as part of this to ensure rural growth is not stifled and policies relating to the development in or outside the community hubs, and the clusters are relevant and positively prepared to appropriate situation on the ground. You can see I have a plan here, and just
so it's not, we can't introduce new evidence that these
I wasn't
buildings.
too sure what to do about that. Okay, it was just a sort of.
So it could have been submitted as part of a statement when you submit your hearing statement, but.
Oh right, I didn't realise that. Okay. So you can see the plan existing is of the existing development settlement boundary. It disregards the new development. It is a solid line that shows an existing boundary to exclude a triangular area of land and housing development off Cottage Lane, which is illogical. The open triangle site that I refer to in my representation is a boundary where I respectfully suggest that it is sensible for the housing built since to be incorporated into the built form. And yet, despite the council saying that in its response to your question whether the boundaries are justified, that this is what will happen, this approach has not been followed here. What I want to say on Tuesday, very, very briefly, is the description of the triangular site in the SA Sustainable Appraisal does not reflect that the situation on the ground. The site is surrounded totally by three sides by housing development, where the description gives the impression of an agricultural or open countryside. The essay does not explore reviewing the boundaries to accommodate the development in the rural area. I suggest that the council should be required to review this development settlement boundary and ensure the existing edge of the settlement development is included. In order, the words of the boundary are changed by a dotted plan, which of course I can't reveal. This is necessary to ensure the boundary is justified and the policies relating to the community hubs and clusters are positively prepared. And thank you very much for my presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To the council, I know you had a chat on this kit outside of the meeting the other day to try and understand the issues and things, so I know you want
Yes,
to respond.
yes, we did. It was a very useful conversation, in fact, so thank you for that. Just as a general point around just responding to the question specifically, which is obviously a more broad question rather than just around a specific area or specific village, we've obviously, as already been spoken about where we seek to begin our approach on the boundaries is where, kind of as of today, look at where the proposed allocations are to be on the map, and then look what other kind of areas are potentially appropriate in that area. Now, we've done that across the board. I think in this instance, with St Martin's, I know where the site is. I know you can't see the site particularly, but I know where the site is. I don't think its inclusion would compromise or in any way the delivery of the guideline for the village in the hub. So I think we are, if you were proposed to consider a modification on that, we would seek to go away and have a think about it, I think, on that point, on its merits. So yeah, I think that's our position on this one at the moment. And if you needed any further information from us to support you on that, from the council, we would be happy to provide that as well.
Thank you, that's helpful. We're keeping a shopping list of things as we go along. We can pick some of them up at the end of the fortnight and also in our letter. So we're on to question 26. Ms Durbin, did you want to say something about settlement limits?
Yes. Right, yes please. So it's Mrs Durbin,
Much Wenlock. The Shropshire Council local plan includes extending the development boundary in a neighbourhood plan area in spite of clear government guidance against such an option without consultation and a referendum. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Inspector Crosby. I would say the proposed alteration on the boundary has been proposed in the Shropshire local plan, which is not a neighbourhood plan, and therefore doesn't need to go down the referendum route on that point. So there is a distinction between a neighbourhood plan and a local plan in that perspective. Bear with me a second. in terms of the response, in terms of why we've sought to do that, I've already set that out again early on this week, I believe, and that is obviously to do with the neighbourhood plan ending in 2026, and obviously this plan is longer than that. So we've had to plan effectively for the area within the context of there being no evidence around the neighbourhood plan, a review of that neighbourhood plan in that area. So.
Thank you, Mr. West. I'll just see if anybody else along. Sorry, did you want to say something?
I just want to say that obviously I think you referred to we didn't engage with the public on that one. I would obviously say we did do that in terms of what we proposed in our local plan. So we have asked the public their view on that, and as you can see by the fact, we've had a number of responses on that point.
Thank you, Mr. West. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, ma'am. You heard the comments this morning about Longdon and the fact that it is now a community hub with a development boundary. And I also heard that the council had exercised some planning judgment after the decision had been made for it to become a hub. That's very good. I wish more people would exercise some planning judgment. It seems a good idea to me. As I said earlier, 50 houses which Longdon's been allocated, the development boundary will not accommodate that number of houses. And if planning judgment has been exercised, then somebody would have recognised that. I can't see much purpose in producing a development boundary for a particular number of houses which isn't going to be deliverable.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Roberts. Do you want to come back on that at all?
Just briefly, the covers the period 2016 to 2038, and it includes existing completions and commitments. So the actual residual guideline, if you like, for Longdon is 27 dwellings. I think it's also important to recognise that whilst the infill development within the development boundary is one source of site, we have wider policies, particularly with regards to affordable housing and affordable exception sites, subsidy sites, for instance, which are also sources of potential supply in settlements like Longdon. And I think that was very much on our minds when we were devising what we considered to be an appropriate guideline for that settlement.
I presume that 50 is an indicative amount. It's not. It's got to be provided, or it's.
It's a guideline. And obviously, I think we've got a question specifically regarding policy P7 later in the day, and obviously that talks about how the guidelines are viewed in the policy framework. So, yeah, I think we can deal with it in that part of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Carden. Mr. Healy.
This is a question to Shropshire Council. A question to Shropshire Council. With regards to the development boundary in cross houses, it is a general question. The boundary development changed from one iteration of the local plan to another, taking out a particular development proposal. Can Shropshire Council confirm that the boundary development that we've now got, the boundary, is going to be is going to be consistent for the next for the lifetime of the plan. So that as far as residents of cross houses are concerned, we won't be getting any more major development based on what we've currently got, or is there a chance that there could be a plan refresh?
Councillor able to answer that.
Yeah, with the development boundary for the plan period until it's reviewed. With specific regard to a good example of consultation from we reviewed the responses received to consultations and made changes in terms of our proposed strategy for the settlement. In terms of the development boundary, as I've just described, the policy for community hubs explains what the development is there for. It finds where open for would be considered merits. Obviously, other settlements, there is still opportunities for affordable schemes where there's evidence needs. I think that, as I say, that's consistently applied for community hubs and other settlements indeed, and we consider that's entirely appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. West.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector Crosby. I think it's worth pointing out that we probably aren't going to be able to provide the assurances for Mr. Healy, because obviously we do run on a plan review process here. So we do have to review the plan, as we've already had a conversation about at this examination already. So when that plan is examined and the kind of when that plan is reviewed and the kind of review we set it under, we may have to look at those areas again. Because I can't provide assurance, I think you're after on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point I was trying to make, Mr. Crosby. The fact that we are defining the boundaries here, but within a number of years there could well be plan refreshes, which leaves people that, you know, I speak to in cross houses very concerned. As it stands at the moment, we are okay with the boundary, but we're fully aware that within 3 or 4 years, this could change, especially if we are defined as a community hub.
Yeah, I mean, obviously any review would require consultation, so as has happened in the past, I know that's no comfort if it's proposed to be changed, but it would be part of a full consultation as part of any review, wouldn't it? Yes.
Oh, of course, yes. We'll go through a normal planning process, so. Yeah.
Okay, any more? I can't see any more. Anybody else wanting to speak on settlement? Sorry, I missed you with Mr. Thomas.
His point, speaking on behalf of Fletcher Homes, just to note, we do have an outstanding objection submitted as part of our Rec 19 to Cross Houses development boundary. So I just wanted to record that. That was all. It's all fully covered in our submission.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Richard Stewart, on behalf of Gleeson Land. It's a general point on the settlement boundaries, and there seems to be a lot of support for extension settlement boundaries. Mr. West accepted that was the case, and it was just, there seems to me a need for a full-scale review of all of the settlement boundaries proposed, based on not only the built development boundaries or the extent of built development, but also on landscape characteristics. And it feels like a settlement topic paper or something along those lines, to actually take the opportunity and into account the other factors that should shape the development of those smaller areas.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Does the council want to respond?
I think our response to that is our evidence base is proportionate, and we consider it is proportionate and has been used in the development of this local plan, and unless we're asked to, we don't intend to put any more evidence in on the basis of that.
Mr. West, any other comments? Oh, sorry, Ms. I didn't see your name then.
Thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of Ford Parish Council. I just wanted to reiterate what that, or support what that gentleman just said, because I think the development boundary in Ford certainly does not include a recently permitted and built scheme. So they should be reviewed. Thank you.
Grove.
Sorry, I don't want to go into the minutiae of this, but within the development boundary of Longdon, unless you're going to be building on people's gardens, the pub car park, a lambing paddock, or an orchard, there is no other room apart from floodplain. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think there's any need to come back on any of those points. Oh, sorry, Mr. Carter.
Thank you. I think Karen was trying to say that we've been allocated 50 houses. There's nowhere to build them within the development.
I think somebody's made that point already, haven't they?
Yes, I appreciate that. But that will mean that developers will come along in a few years' time and say, you haven't managed to meet the target of 50 houses, we're going to try and build alongside, whatever kind of reason they're going to use. We're back fighting against developers because we haven't managed to meet that target. And that is the problem we've got, and I'd like somebody to reassure us that they'll look very unfavourably on building outside of our boundary. Thank you.
So, as I understand it, any application will be considered on the basis of the development management policies in the plan that would consider things like flooding and all sorts of other issues, and it's not a requirement to meet 50, is it? And I think, as it has been said, it's actually less than 50 is the residual amount, is it? It's 20-something.
That's correct, and the point I was going to make, it's a guideline, it's not a target, and that's quite an important point. And obviously we do have the policies around managing development in the countryside, so in our view anything outside the boundary would be in that area of countryside, and we'll get on to that later on in the examination, but yes, there is a planning policy which we will be using in determining those applications. Again, I can't assure you of anything on that point, but it's the reason why we have a plan-led process, in order to give you some assurance.
Okay, so we'll move on from that point now. We'll move back to the beginning of the agenda, which so question one. This is quite a general question, so I think it's probably better to deal with this through other questions on the agenda. If there's any issues at the end, we'll just pick them up because it is very generic, and it can overlap with some of the DTC duty to cooperate things we talked about yesterday in terms of the strategic policies. So moving to question 2, this deals specifically with policy SP1. So this includes criteria to assess development proposals against, and the question is whether it replicates other policies in the local plan and whether it's necessary and effective. And really whether they're actually objectives rather than policies. Do the council want to address that? And then I'll bring anybody in that wants to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I'll start off. The intention of to effectively be a gateway policy. Its primary purpose is to contribute to the overall strategy, with particular focus on design quality of places. And it provides a starting point for more detailed policies of the plan. I think that's really important, and that it effectively it's for detailed policies. However, we consider in doing so, it includes high requirements against which development proposals can be considered, albeit supplemented by the right framework.
Thank you. I'll just add to that and say in the explanation it gives a little bit more information about the origins of the policy, and that's quite useful in the context of that around the plan, the sort of localised master planning process for Shrewsbury, which is on running at the moment, and so it gives a little bit more information about where this came from as a sort of origin. Now, I would agree it's high level, and I can see where you're coming from around these potentially could sound more like objectives, but we do think they are important to put them into the policy context in order for the decision maker to have regard when determining a planning application. It might not be the overarching view, and certainly the decision maker would need to apply other areas of the plan as well, but I think it's a very important initial policy for a decision maker to look at, and in that instance it is looking at those high level issues which Shropshire Council in particular thinks are particularly important in the Shropshire context. So I can see why you say in fact about objectives, but we do think it's important that it's framed within the policy environment.
Okay, thank you. Something that's been raised by others is a few people said that it should have a reference to climate change, or the reference should be more ambitious. Do you want to respond on that point?
Yeah, I think it's obviously, again, it's the first policy in the plan. It's not expected it is going to be the only policy which people will look at in determining that. It does reference mitigating the impacts of climate change within the policy, but obviously policy SP3, which we'll go on to, expands upon that as well. So, as I said, it's a gateway in to the plan. It's not supposed to be the only kind of area a decision maker would use, but I think, particularly on that point, actually, I think it frames those overarching objectives of the plan in a quite a nice way to start the plan off with. But I think that's our response on that.
Okay, thank you. Are there anybody want to make any comment on policy SP1? I've obviously tried to pick up some comments from people. No? Okay, that was an easy one, wasn't it? So moving on to SP, and we're moving down. Let me just get the numbering right. So I think we're up to number 11 now, aren't we? So we're jumping on when we dealt with 10. So we'll move on to SP3. That little segue from Mr. Westbrook brings us neatly into policy SP3 and whether it's justified, effective and consistent with national policy. So some of the comments that have been raised is about whether it should include targets and can it be monitored, whether the policy's been viability tested, and should it positively encourage the use and supply of renewable energy and low carbon energy. So it might be worth capturing those points in your opening, and then we'll move round. Yeah, hello. You've got the hot seat today.
I am, yes. Had a hard day on Tuesday, but no. And the question is whether it's justified, effective and consistent with national policy and national guidance. And my response to the matters, issues and questions sets out, it goes through each part of SP3 and shows where it's consistent with NPPF and NPPG. So with that respect, I feel like we've adequately demonstrated that the policy complies with not legal requirements, with policy and guidance. With respect to the other questions, some of these came up on Tuesday, and I think we dealt with the carbon budget question. There is no legal requirement, or there's actually no policy requirement for a local plan to set a carbon budget. So if we had have set a carbon budget, I imagine everybody in the room from the development industry would have been saying to us, why have you done that? It's unsound, you can't, and we would be coming under attack from that. So much as it seems like an attractive and simple solution, it's not one that we felt we were justified in pursuing. can't remember the other questions. Sorry.
Some of the other points that were raised by you about whether it's been viability tested, and the other one was whether it should positively encourage the use and supply of renewable and low carbon energy, so NPPF Para 155.
My colleague will answer the viability question.
Okay.
I mean, I'll deal with the positively encouraging question. I would say it does positively encourage paragraph 2, integration or supporting both on and off-site delivery of renewable and low-carbon energy. There are A, B, C and D sections in there which deal with provision of renewable energy, and also it's important to remember that this is a strategic policy which sets the framework for other policies within the plan, and so we do have another policy, just get the reference correct. We've got DP11, which is minimising carbon emissions, and we've got DP26, which is DP26 is specifically about renewable energy infrastructure. So it's not that you have to put everything in SP3, it's just that this sets the framework for those other two policies. I'll hand over to my colleague on the viability question.
Thank you, Ms. Cathcart.
Thank you. The proposals within the local plan have been informed by the viability study, which is document EV 115.01 and its appendices like 2 and 3. In terms of the policy that have financial implications, they've been specifically considered with our assessment. As such, we consider our proposals informed by the viability study are appropriate. I'm sure we'll deal with this in greater detail in matter 8.
Thank you, Mr. Corden. So I'll move on to what we've done before. So Mr. Deves.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. As you alluded to, repeated some of the points we made. As Ms. Tetzel said, we did consider this under question 20 in matter 1 to some extent. The difference here is that this question also considers the planning guidance, which was not considered in matter 1. We have a lot of difficulty with planning guidance. You have on your desk there in your green binder, I think, the National Planning Framework document. You didn't get where I am today, as they say more. However, I would submit that such an analysis document for the guidance does not exist. It exists on the website. It is added to continuously. It's very variable. There is no, apart from conducting a PhD project, there is no coherent way of assessing its internal consistency and so on. And particularly, we looked at the guidance on the question of renewable energy. The only sections we can find that are relevant go back to 2014 and 2015. In light of the very significant changes in the energy market that have taken place since, we regard those sections as effectively of no value. Therefore, it is impossible to say that this policy is consistent with guidance, because the guidance is effectively void from our perspective. So that, I think, is an important consideration. The other point I would just make briefly, and I have no wish to teach you what you are trying to do. On Tuesday, and Mr. Tetzel again, as I said today, I'm not here to debate in the sense this is remission and commission of what the council is obliged or not obliged to do in the preparation of its plan. To use a bake-off analogy, what I'm interested in and what we are inspecting here is the pudding. Is the pudding effective? We are not interested in debates about how the kitchen was constructed, what ingredients were used, and so on. And I think it's important that we bear that point in mind, particularly yourselves. I hope you don't regard that as particularly overbearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the plan has to be drawn up to be consistent with national policy, as you say, national policy changes and ebbs and flows, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the void in the obvious void in policy. We've heard in several topics this morning the debate around what is something that is 5 years old, 3 years old, 2 years old. We've seen a lot about boundary and essay inspections. But I would submit in this particular case, the national guidance is effectively absent.
Yeah, so we're assessing whether this plan is sound and whether there's some omissions that make it unsound. Do the council want to respond on any of that, or I think it's difficult, isn't it, because there's not, if there isn't national guidance, there's nothing that you can't say the council's not, it's not meeting national guidance because it's a chicken and egg situation.
This is why this is why I use the pudding analogy.
Yes.
It is the proof of the pudding that we are after here.
Yes, it's quite a problematic situation for us on this one, isn't it? Ultimately, we believe we've got an approach which is sound, which is the sort of the headline on this one. But I don't think we've got anything more to add aside from that, really.
Thank you. Just moving on, Mr. O'Brien.
There we go. Thank you. I'm representing Wayne Estates, and they've got a few concerns regarding policy SP3, particularly section 2A and how it interacts with the DM policy DP11, the minimising carbon emissions. SP32A includes a requirement for all residential development to integrate renewable and low carbon energy systems, so that's kind of more of a DM matter. So, but it links into viability in matter 8, and is this the right forum to really talk about that, or?
So there are always tricky reasons that because it potentially, I suppose, because this requires compliance with DP11, and if your client's concerned with the requirements of DP11, then it's probably a stage 2 matter that we discuss with the. We'll look at the mechanics of that policy.
It's just specifically 2A says all residential development should integrate renewable energy systems as a sort of requirement. That's wondered why it was a catch-all.
Yeah, and it's obviously a viability issue, presumably.
I'm coming next week. I can raise it then. Oh, it's up to you.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if the council can comment really on whether this particular policy's been viability. Well, I suppose whether DP11's been viability tested, isn't it? Because that's what it's requiring. So we're looking at this policy now, and so we're looking at this particular element of this policy. So we need to consider it now. But it has. I think
so. Yeah. So I mean, it's really just to do with the as I've stated, it's. The need to integrate renewable and low-carbon energy systems into all residential developments over one dwelling, and also seeking to maximise the use of district and heating and cooling systems on sites that are considered to be relatively modest. And DP11 is referenced in Section 2A of Policy SP3, and it expands on this by stating that 10% of the predicted energy needs of development should come forward from renewable sources, on top of requiring the minimum 19% improvement in energy performance requirement set out in 2013 Part L building regs. Now, both of those requirements have been tested in the Council's viability study, and the results illustrate from what I can see that the significant proportion of delivery in the south of the county would be unviable, and that's expanded upon in our Matter 8 statement. But it's really the interaction with DP11 which introduces the energy hierarchy, and it sets out the order of that hierarchy, highlighting that reducing the need for energy primarily is at the top. So while Shropshire Council is correct to sort of identify that energy hierarchy, it's wrong to sort of circumnavigate that and jump straight to introducing renewable energy as part of all residential development. So whilst the points are acknowledged in the Council's matter statement that the MPPS seeks to support and identify opportunities for renewable energy supply, it's suggested that the requirement within SP3 for all residential development to integrate such systems should be amended.
The council wants to come out, and we may return to it. We'll probably will return to it again at various points during the full examination.
The requirements of DP11 were specifically considered within the viability assessment. I believe, is it that your client is promoting? Yeah, because obviously your presentation specifically confirmed the viability of your site having due regard to policy requirements. So your is considered to be viable. Yeah. Obviously we've undertaken viability assessments to inform proposals, and the topic paper that supports that, in which we've had engagement with the site services on proposed applications. We feel that I don't demonstrate too much into my work, but I do think we have a viable and livable plan. Obviously DPR also includes flexibility, Matter 8, so going straight through hopefully that gives you a bit more context.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Mr. Green.
Thank you. John for CPRE again. You've had solutions which indicate that we think that SP3 does not go far enough. It shouldn't simply be a matter of doing the minimum to comply with legislation. Shropshire Council are free to go beyond the minimum guidance, as they do with housing. They're not proposing to go with the minimum guidance, which is the OAM figure of 25,894 on housing. They're going beyond that. They could go beyond with climate change matters. Most of the world, including Shropshire Council, recognises that we are in a climate emergency. The Shropshire Council could have taken a more proactive approach to that emergency in this plan if they're to do more than pay lip service to this emergency. There is also surely an opportunity for the inspectorate to ensure that more is done in local plans as you go about your business of examining them, if that also is to be more than just a compliance exercise. Numbers is to increase emissions perhaps by 6%, was what we heard on Tuesday. Unless we can demonstrate that the measures in SP3 have to wait, then the plan is less sustainable and is on that basis alone. I think we've heard from the previous speaker that in practice it's viability that is the issue here, or is one of the issues. Viability is the calculations that are done in order to show that people make a profit. So we're talking about making profit versus the planet. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. But just point out in terms of our responsibility, we can't require the council to do more than is required, for example, by national guidance.
It's all matter.
Yeah. The council want to come back on?
Yeah, I think it's just worth mentioning that we do feel as though we are increasing above the level of the guidance. The national level, particularly with our approach to renewable energy on site, that's more than is required at the national level, and it's done for very good reasons, as Mr. Green has set out quite usefully. But we obviously have to make sure we have a viable plan. Yeah, obviously it's a soundness point and it's a viability plan, and your point about development industry making profit, well, I'm sure most people here today would say, well, that's part of the point. It's about making sure development achieves as much as it can, and that's where we feel we are at.
Thank you. Are there anybody else want to say anything else on policy SP3? So I didn't see Miss Harding and then Mr. Can't remember your name. I can't see your name. Miss. Oh, I was pointing to you. Sorry, I thought you were both wanting to speak. All right. Miss Harding.
Thank you. Yes, Joanne Harding from the Home Builders Federation. I'd just like to say that we're very supportive of the council seeking to address climate change. We're supportive in terms of them looking at the PPG and bringing forward elements of the policy and the suggestions that they make in terms of contributing to and mitigating the adaptation of climate change. We do, however, have some concerns that the PPG also looks for local standards to be brought in terms of robust and credible evidence, but also that they should have regard to the housing standards review, which sought to reduce the overlap between planning and building regulations, and to consolidate the national framework in terms of building standards through the building regulations. So our concerns really lie around the overlap there between the updates to Part L, the future home standard, Part S in relation to electric vehicle charging points and water efficiency through Part G. And I think we just seek some clarity there where there is elements of overlap. And obviously, again, we don't want to go into the more detailed elements that come up in DP 11 and 20 and 26, but I'm sure those points will be reiterated at that point as well. But just to ensure that we are focusing those efforts in the right places, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Harding. Does the council want to respond on any of that?
We don't feel there is an overlap. Well, there may be a slight overlap which we might have to deal with when we get to DP11 because things are moving fast in terms of the Future Homes and Building Standard. But as the plan stands, Future Homes and Building Standard will be implemented through changes to building regulations, which is not something that the plan seeks to duplicate or to, or confuse anything. So we feel that there is a clear distinction between what's happening with Homes and Building Standard, and for other people in the room, I'll just make the point that energy efficiency is not a matter for local plans at the moment. The government originally had the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was something that local plans were looking at way back about 10, 12 years ago. But since then, governments have taken an approach to energy efficiency through improvements to building regulations, and one of the changes that came in on the 15th of June was something like a 32% uplift in building energy efficiency. So this is moving a bit fast for us in local plan circles. We can't possibly keep up with that. But basically, we don't feel there is an overlap between the plan and building regs.
Thank you, Ms Tatlas. Is there anybody else that I've missed? Just wave your hand in the air if I've missed anybody else. No? Moving on to policy SP4. So the question is whether policy SP4 is necessary as it rehearses national planning policy, contrary to any advice in the PPG. So this is about sustainable development. I think the council said happy to remove that policy. Is that the case?
Yes, question. I think generally speaking we understand exactly where you're coming from and would be comfortable if you consider that to be a modification.
Okay, we'll make a note of that one. I presume nobody's particularly keen on that not happening, so nobody wants to comment on that? No? Okay, right. Moving on to question 13. So the framework at paragraph 28 advises that non-strategic policies should be used by local authorities and communities to set out more detailed policies for specific areas, neighbourhoods or types of development. This can include the provision of infrastructure and community facilities at local level, establishing design principles. So that's paraphrasing a little bit. So the question is whether policies SP5 and SP6 are strategic policies, or whether there are any development management policies. The general consensus seemed to be, we got back from people, was that there should be DM policies. The council saying they're strategic policies and want them to remain that way. Does the council want to say anything before we go around the room? And it's something we'll have to ultimately take a view on as we...
Thank you, Inspector Crosby. I think, yes, I think you've rehearsed our view on that point quite well. We do think these issues cover very strategic matters. It is recognised that some of the detail may be more akin to a development management type approach, but we do feel as though they are overarching policies and therefore are in the right place in the plan. It's important to give context in the strategic part of the plan to the elements of the plan which we think are particularly important, and we think they are in the right place.
One way of doing a sense check on whether something's a strategic policy or not is to ask yourself, is this a policy that a neighbourhood development plan would be expected to be consistent with? Because you know NDPs are required to be consistent with strategic policies and local plans. And therefore, if it is the sort of policy an NDP should be consistent with, that's probably a sense check indicator that it should be in the strategic policies part of the plan.
Thank you, that's quite helpful, yes. Yeah, because there is often this kind of debate about some of these policies, and yeah. I'll go around the room again, and if anyone wants to comment. Mr. Dean.
Thank you, ma'am. I seem to start first. I'd like to start from the question of whether SP5 is strategic or not. I've not been party to any of the other discussions you allude to, but it seems to me, and I rather reflect the view of the previous speakers, sorry, that's the name I've forgotten, but I will. Mr. Richards, I do apologise, sir, that if you are to view this as a management policy, it must sit within a strategic policy. Otherwise, it has no real effect. And since I cannot see a strategic policy, I rather tend to the view that it is therefore a strategic policy of itself. So that's the starting point. Is it were established with a small e? The question is, does it work as a strategic policy? And our view is that it does not. It is supposed to deliver high-quality design and improvements of...
That's the next question, I think.
It's part of whether SP5... Are you going to consider SP5's own...
The next question talks about SP5 and more detail about whether it's justified, effective. So is your response about whether it should be a development management policy or...
I would combine the response... Yeah, if we can come back...
We'll come back to if you want, that might be easier for everybody. If we come back, yeah, and then we've got 6 as well, haven't we? So it'll be 13, 14 and 15, and SP5 and SP6 are different policies. So, carry on, we'll make it work.
Thank you, Mark. So, in a sense then, deal with question 14, as it now is in front of us. SP5 sets out improving sustainability and energy efficiency and so on, but later on it only talks about features of physical architectural detailing. We consider it to be inconsistent within itself as a strategic policy, and therefore unsound. It does not carry through on the intent of promoting energy efficiency to the extent that it should. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go around the room to see if there are any other comments before I come back to the council. Is there anybody else want to comment? Mr. Carter.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Carter, sat next to each.
Yeah, that's this isn't it? Because this is my first contribution, I should introduce myself. My name is David Carter. I work for the consultants Tyler Parks, and I'm here representing the Midlands Partnership Foundation NHS Trust and the Shropshire Community NHS Trust, but also bearing in mind the sort of reorganisation and the formation of integrated care boards. I think in due course we'll also be sort of referring to the other parts of the NHS in Shropshire. We've made detailed representations, and in relation to question 13 we didn't actually make any comments on this, but could I support the Council's view that policy SP6 should be regarded as a strategic policy, and the reason for that is that I think we would regard the provision of infrastructure in principle as a strategic matter, and it's definitely something that has implications that are more than local and even potentially in relation to health services cross-boundary too, so I think it definitely would count as a strategic policy. I wanted to say some more about question 15. I can either do that now or later.
We'll come back to that. It's quite a different matter, I think, isn't it? But that was a helpful contribution. Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on these? No. Okay, so we'll move on to question. Did the council want to come back on any of that? No. Question 14 is more about the detail of whether policy SP5 aligns with the principles of the West Midlands Design Charter, whether there is scope for tension between the policy and DB24, which is the AONB policy, whether it's justified, effective and consistent with national policy. I just realised actually we're coming up to 3 o'clock out, which is when we said we'd have a break. So I think we'll have a break now, just a quick break, and then come back to question 14. Should we say 15 minutes? I think that should be hopefully long enough. Is it enough? We'll carry on until it... Oh, it looks like they're loitering outside. Maybe waiting. I don't know whether he's... Oh, he's talking to somebody.
He was complaining about the length of time he waited, so I couldn't.
He was complaining. Oh, I think he'd probably be glad when we've all gone home. It's probably been the bane of his life this week. We'll carry on until it arrives. I think he's busy talking to somebody, and we'll just adjust the time accordingly.
I think the gentleman at the door was just finding out if they're ready.
All right, great.
Yes.
Oh, that's easy because it's just all on a trolley, isn't it? We don't have to say anything. No.
So, Mr. Crosby, I wonder if I could just raise a matter. It might take up a few minutes while the people are setting up the coffee. To deal with the question of minutes and other documentation around those 5 meetings. We've had nothing from the council as to whether we're going to be receiving those. I wondered if there's any update that we could receive.
We will not be giving a rolling update. When we have something to contribute, we will contribute it. We have explained to Learned Friend what the position is. We've had direction from you, and that's the matter, where the matter rests.
So the council are going to do the best to provide those, and through the programme officer they have contact with yourself if they need to contact you with any of that. And it will obviously, as I say, need to be made available anyway for everybody's benefit, including ours.
Yeah, obviously there's a bit of a resource issue here, seeing that we are here and not elsewhere, which is fairly obvious comment, isn't it? Apologies for that. But that has an impact on the time frame of that. We will do the best we can. As I said yesterday, we're not trying to be challenging, we're just trying to be realistic. Okay.
Yeah, so hopefully, because we're not sitting tomorrow, are we? We'll hopefully start to resolve that matter as a priority tomorrow when...
And potentially Monday as well.
And Monday, yes.
Monday's non-Synte. So yes, we will do our best. We'll do our very best. But obviously we're aware that anything we submit has to be submitted to the wider environment, and so there's a bit of a process there.
And presumably the council, if you put it on the website, put it on the latest news bit as well, so that people can sort of identify that it's been added and things.
We'll speak with the programme officer.
Yeah, and get that organised, okay. So it's actually done at 3 o'clock now. Yeah, Mr. Reid, I think that's the best the council can do. I think the days of having the luxury of lots of people in development, in local planners teams has gone, hasn't it, where you had people sat running around doing bits and things.
What you feel is what you get here, sorry.
Yeah. So 3 o'clock, if we're able to approach, and hopefully we'll all have managed to grab a cup of tea and, as I said this morning, bring it back to the table, that's not a problem, okay.